Hello and welcome. Could America's first black president be dividing the country more than uniting it? Many people celebrated a turning point in U.S. race relations with the election of Barack Obama, but others saw it as an opportunity to restore a different set of values.
I think it's become more racial. Because of the vote, we're not in a post-racial America. It's becoming more racial. Race has become a bigger issue today than it's been in 20, 30 years.
They are normally on the fringes of American politics, but now the white supremacist movement is finding new strength and is attempting to draw on conservative concerns over the economy, immigration, and the changing shape of America's government. You saw there an excerpt from the documentary White Power USA, which will be featured on Al Jazeera's People and Power program. We'll tell you more about that a bit later in the show. Now, those supporting white power have highlighted the Tea Party movement, which was largely created to focus on healthcare and taxes, and turned it into a possible source of disenchanted voters who could be drawn into a more radical agenda.
I think the Tea Party movement is the beginning of a very good awakening, and realize we only need to wake up 10% of the people to win this thing.
As this right-wing populist movement spreads more and more anger and more scapegoating, and more elected officials and media demagogues encourage them, it's more likely that violence will occur.
That protest is the beginning stages of a revolution, and revolution is the only thing that's ever changed the government.
So today we ask, are white supremacists in America capitalizing on mainstream issues to legitimize their radical agenda? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or email, and we also welcome your phone calls on the show. Joining me to discuss this now is Leonard Zeskind, president of the Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights. Mr. Zeskind has been fighting and writing about racism for more than 30 years. He's the author of Blood and Politics, The History of the White Nationalist Movement. Also joining us through a broadband connection in Boston is Chip Burley, a senior analyst with Political Research Associates. Mr. Burley has spent over 25 years investigating extreme right-wing hate groups. He's also on the advisory board of the Defending Dissident Foundation. Now, from New York, we also have Rick Rowley joining us. He's the producer of White Power USA, which you saw there, and an independent filmmaker whose other investigative projects have included a film on U.S. policy in Iraq's Anbar province. Gentlemen, I welcome you all to the show. And Leonard Zeskind, I'll start with you, sir, if I could. And thinking about a report that was released earlier last year by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, it said that the threat by right-wing extremists was the biggest to America today. Now, that report was later retracted because that definition was a little vague in exactly who they were. But how real do you see the threat to be from white supremacists in this day and age?
Well, I don't see it primarily as a violent threat or a domestic terrorist threat, as that report indicated. It's more of a political phenomenon now that's reached into the mainstream, and it's a very serious problem.
So how relevant are those issues of economy, immigration, and perhaps even having a black president in power, helping those groups to get a stronger foothold among the American population?
I think immigration has been the main white nationalist issue for some years now. Prior to the election of Barack Obama, white nationalists have motorized that anti-immigrant movement, and they've had a big impact on policy, both through congressional and state level political bodies, legislative bodies.
Chip Burley, give me your perspective. How do you feel that white supremacist groups are capitalizing on mainstream issues to try to become a stronger force?
Well, I think two things are happening. I agree with what Leonard said, but I also think that if you go out and interview folks in places that I've been recently, like in Montana and Idaho and the state of Washington, you find that a lot of grassroots on the ground activists are talking about increasing anger spilling out into, verbal assaults. And we see since the inauguration of Obama, there have been 9 murders allegedly carried out by people who were wound up in some sort of right-wing white supremacist or anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. So you not only have the major politicians and major media people getting on this white nationalist bandwagon, but you also have other people moving into a more insurgent, militant, and potentially violent mode.
Chip, let me put an email we got from a viewer in Colombia, if I may to you, sir. It came from Paul Wolf, who wrote in saying, U.S. right-wing extremists have always used Revolutionary War imagery the Minutemen, etc. It's a poor choice of themes for conservatives to use as well. The crackpots really do want a violent revolution. But is that clear nowadays? Is it easier to, is it easy enough to separate the sort of the harder conservatives with those on the fringes of the supremacist movement?
Well, I think the term crackpot is not helpful. You have very angry people, and they can either be moved into an electoral backlash built around white nationalism, or also built around white nationalism, they can move into more insurgent, militant, and potentially violent mode. So I think the problem here is this liberal hangover from discredited social science that says that there's good, politically astute people in the political center, Democrats and Republicans, and then the next step out are violent revolutionaries, when in fact throughout U.S. history, between the electoral system and the ultra insurgent groups, there's a very large body of dissident groups who are not violating the law in any way, but need to be confronted in terms of their bigotry, whether it's conscious or not.
Now, Rick Rowley, we showed excerpts from your documentary there, White Power USA. I saw the whole thing through, very disturbing material in that, of course, and I'm hoping our viewers will get a chance to see it, of course, on People in Power, which we'll feature later in the week. Let me ask you, though, in what way has the media, particularly the more extreme commentators, we have people such as Glenn Beck, for example, which you feature in that documentary, who says Obama is a white race hater, helped to make the white supremacists legitimize their concerns among the general public?
Well, they've played a huge role. From the very beginning, when these Minutemen vigilante militias were formed along the border to police the border and to fight against immigration from Mexico, they were given a space, a seat at the table in the mainstream media all over the U.S. They were treated as legitimate analysts on the issue of immigration, when in fact they were leading vigilante militias that were operating on the border and had harbored all sorts of bizarre insurrectionist revolutionary ideas about America. Then you fast forward to today, and you see, the Tea Party movement beginning as an AstroTurf movement, beginning as a movement that was convened by far-right radio and television commentators like Glenn Beck. But it's important to recognize that might have been its roots, but it tapped into a wide mainstream populist rage with the administration. While they play a role in sparking things, I think it's wrong for us not to recognize that there is actually at the grassroots a populist rage that progressives are failing to organize. And because they're failing to organize it, then white nationalist groups are able to move in and take advantage of it and channel it into their own organizational ends.
We've got a caller from Virginia on the line. John, thanks for joining us. What would you like to add?
Well, sir, a lot of what I'm seeing right now with all these groups is reminiscent of what was going on during the early 90s, during the Clinton administration. And I just wanted to see if your guest could comment on that, to see if they saw any similarities and where it might go.
Leonard Zeskin, if I could get a perspective on that from you.
Yes, it's absolutely the case. In fact, the Minutemen organizations started before the election of Barack Obama. White nationalists routinely kill a dozen to a dozen and a half people each year. Some years it's much worse. This year, actually, compared to, say, 1987, has not been as bad. And what you see now does remind us very much of what happened in the mid-1990s with the growth of the militia. The difference being that we're 10 to 15 years further towards a time when white people will become a demographic minority in a nation of minorities. And it's that prospect that is motivating many of the groups that you saw in the program on white power. They want to run this place. They don't know how to share. And the time is coming when they will be out completely of having a chance to run things.
Chip Belay, if I could put an email we got from the United Arab Emirates to you, sir. This one is from Jamil Brownson, who says, history reveals deeply embedded racial and religious biases as being endemic to U.S. WASP culture. Ethnocentrism is a human norm. Is that fair, saying that it's natural for a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christian to naturally being prone to being racism any more than anyone else?
while the wasp still has its sting. I think that the history of America is a sense among many white people that they're both superior and divinely ordained to run the country on behalf of everyone else. So, you know, it may be a little biting, but in terms of how ethnic strife occurs, it's under different kinds of stress. In the United States, white people have banded together against immigrants and people of color and the Native population, and more recently around gender, like abortion providers and gay people. So there is people want to hold on to power, and in so much as white men and women are losing power in their minds, they're reacting to it. But I don't think it's just race. I think it's a combination of racial fears, gender fears, and economic fears. And the most current sociology talks about people may be wrong in fearing that they're economically downward mobile, and the national economic surveys might show that they're not. But if they think they are, that's what matters.
Well, Rick Rowley, this email came in from Bill Lewis in Louisiana in the USA. If I can put this to you, it says, these are a group of people who will always exist. Many are uneducated, but others are con men or prison groups. There are very few thinking people in the mix. Making your documentary, would you agree with that?
Well, no. I mean, there's a continuum of a whole bunch of different kinds of groups, going from, you know, what looks like an idiot fringe of the people who are going out and committing hate crimes to, you know, the right wing of the Republican Party and populists who are involved in the Tea Parties. One of the most troubling things to me over the course of making this was how many normal Americans who didn't even consider themselves to be prejudiced would join and become members of and organizers within a white nationalist movement, because people, for instance, we went to Ripley, Mississippi, this tiny town that's had 4 of its 5 factories shut down in the last 2 years, and just formed a chapter of the Council of Conservative Citizens, which is a white nationalist group. I mean, people there joined because of the economy, because they saw bailout happening that was saving Wall Street while Main Street went under. And so they had this anger against both parties, and there was no progressive movement for them to join. And so they were channeled into the only group that was out there in the street against the administration, and that was a white nationalist movement.
Gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to stand by. We have many more questions, but we have to take a short break here. We're back with our discussion in just a moment, so don't go away.